Welcome to Learn the Word, the daily Bible teaching program of Calvary Chapel of Delta and Pastor Doug McLean. Today, we're joining Pastor Doug for part one of the message he's titled, Feel Like Running Away? So if you're not driving, grab your Bible and open up to Psalm 55 as we begin.
As David went through a very difficult season, the Holy Spirit gave David the words to these psalms that are before us. The first, a psalm written to instruct, to inspire other people to think, to consider, or to gain insight. It's called a contemplation. Although we're not expressly told in the text the setting or the history that gives us the background of this psalm, we know that if you look at David's history that's revealed in 1st and 2nd Samuel, this psalm best fits the time of his son Absalom's rebellion, particularly as David discovered that his trusted counselor, a man named Ahithophel, had joined with Absalom, supporting Absalom in his attempt to remove David from the throne. And so coming to this psalm, if you've had a rebellious child, or you've been betrayed, or you've discovered that somebody that you thought was in the same boat with you, rowing with you, was actually not only rowing the opposite direction, but actually trying to sink your ship, this psalm might resonate with you. There's instruction here for you, lessons to help you go through difficult seasons of adversity. So let's see what we can learn from this. Psalm 55, beginning in verse 1. To the chief musician with stringed instruments, a contemplation of David. Give ear to my prayer, O God, and do not hide yourself from my supplication. Attend to me and hear me. I am restless in my complaint and moan noisily because of the voice of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked. For they bring down trouble upon me, and in wrath they hate me. Now notice, as this psalm begins, how David continually refers to himself. Just looking at these verses, he wrote of my prayer, my supplication. He said, Lord, attend to me, hear me, my complaint. They bring trouble upon me. They hate me. And it continues through the psalm. Now, sometimes people get the idea that it's not spiritual to pray for yourself, or even that it's wrong to pray for yourself. This psalm shows otherwise. In fact, if you consider Jesus and his life, we know that he prayed for himself, certainly in the garden. If it's possible, Father, take this cup from me, but nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Also, as he hung on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? So certainly it's okay to pray for yourself. And David here did the right thing by taking his situation over to the Lord. It's so wonderful that access is available to us. And it's amazing that the Lord, the creator of the heavens and the earth, actually wants to hear from us. He knows everything that you're facing. He knows not only what you're facing, but he knows how you're feeling. He knows the outside, he knows the inside. And it truly is an act of worship, an expression of faith to bring your situation to the Lord in prayer. It's acknowledging, Lord, I know that you're the one that can make a difference. That's why I'm talking to you about it. I believe in you, Lord, that you're the one that can help me out of this situation. So it's an act of worship in a sense, because you're confessing the reality of what you know about his ability and his care. Now at this moment, David evidently felt like God was being unresponsive to his request. That's why he said, give ear to my prayer and do not hide yourself from my supplication. So if you ever had a time where you're praying and praying and praying and you don't feel like God's listening, you're not the only one. Here, David is going through a season like that. He had this need. He felt like he wasn't being helped. He didn't feel like the Lord was paying attention to him. So he expressed that to the Lord. He was just honestly expressing his heart. Now, he wasn't blaming God. Verse 3, he made it clear that it was actually what his enemy was saying, and the pressure of the wicked or the guilty and the trouble that they brought, the anger and hate that they had towards him that resulted in his restlessness. So he wasn't blaming God. He's bringing it to the Lord, and he's saying, I know it's what these people are doing. And notice that he didn't complain to people. He took it to the Lord, and he prayed through it. Again, very instructive for us. Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. Philippians 2, 14 and 15 says, do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may be blameless and harmless children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. And it's really one of the keys to maintaining your witness in this world is to take your complaints to God instead of becoming a grumbler and complainer. That's what the rest of the world around us is doing. Have you noticed it? If you want to start a conversation, just say, well, it's terribly cold tonight, isn't it? You know? Or how about those elections? I mean, it doesn't take much to start a conversation by expressing some kind of complaint. In fact, most people do the opposite of what David does here. Most people complain and don't pray. David's praying, not complaining. Now, no doubt, people can make your life difficult. When people are talking about you, when they're saying hurtful things towards you, or when they hate you, it can be very difficult to handle. But instead of complaining to people about it, to get their sympathy, let it drive you to the Lord. Let it inspire you to pray. For really, the Lord is the only one that has the full ability to change your situation. Your difficult situation, if you take it to prayer, might lead to a fresh discovery of God's resources. You might see him work in ways that you've never seen him work before. Very important to take it to him. David continued in verse 4. He said, my heart is severely pained within me, and the terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fearfulness and trembling have come upon me, and horror has overwhelmed me. Now, David had discovered that his own son Absalom was organizing a rebellion against him. Read 2 Samuel 15 for the background. 2 Samuel 15. And as Absalom was executing his plan, moving forward with his plot to take the throne, even plotting to kill his own father, it hurt him deeply, as you can only imagine how that would hurt. And here we see that typically the fearless giant killer, the great military leader, confesses in this psalm that I'm afraid. In fact, it goes beyond that. He describes being terrified, being fearful and trembling, being horrified, and here just very honest about it. Like Paul, who wrote to the church at Corinth, reflecting on his time there, his arrival there. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 3, he said this, 1 Corinthians 2, 3, I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. Look, it is not wrong to be afraid. It's not a sin to be afraid. But we shouldn't be controlled by fear. And a key to keeping that from happening, allowing fear to control you, is to do exactly what David did here. And that is you take it to the Lord in prayer. And you say, well, I already did that. Well, do it again. Well, I already did that. Well, you do it again. You continually take the situation to the Lord in prayer. James chapter 4, verse 6 says, James 4, 6, but he gives more grace. Therefore, he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So humbling yourself and taking it to the Lord is a key. You don't have to pretend. You don't have to act like you're not afraid. That doesn't help. You just be honest with your feelings and you say, God, I'm actually terrified right now. I'm afraid right now. I'm concerned right now. You just take it to the Lord. David's a great example of that. And he continued there in verse 6, and he said to the Lord, he said, so I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Indeed, I would wander far off and remain in the wilderness, Selah. I would hasten my escape from the windy storm and tempest. So David wanted to run away. He wanted to take off. He wanted to get away from the situation. It was so painful, so hurtful, so stressful, so complex. He just wanted to leave. You ever felt that way? Like the only thing I want to do is just leave. Or am I the only one? That's a natural reaction to a painful situation. Just think about it. If you touch something that's hot, it's your natural reaction to pull back from it, to get away from it. Emotionally, if you've been hurt, it's natural to pull back. You read the scriptures, you'll see this demonstrated time and time again. You can think of those in scripture that ran. Jonah ran, didn't he? Elijah ran. Jeremiah wanted to run, Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 2 says. And when David was younger, he ran. The disciples, they fled in shock and surprise and disappointment. Look, it's natural to pull back. It's natural to try to escape, to run, to flee, to just get away from a situation. But as you know, hopefully, it's typically not the best move. Look at Scripture. It wasn't for Jonah. It wasn't for Elijah. It wasn't for Jeremiah. It wasn't for David. It wasn't for the disciples, but they did. Now, there are times when it might be appropriate, but I would say only at the Lord's direction. So how do you know that? Again, the key is to bring it to the Lord, take how you're feeling to the Lord, and be honest with Him about it. You see, oftentimes when people run, they make things worse. Oftentimes when people run, they miss out. Oftentimes when people run, they only delay the inevitable. Because when they run and they show up somewhere, they're still there. The issue hasn't been dealt with. Now, in verse 9, David prayed, making what seems to be a biblically inspired suggestion. Look at verse 9. He said, "Destroy, O Lord, and divide their tongues, for I have seen violence and strife in the city. Day and night they go around it on its walls. Iniquity and trouble are also in the midst of it. Destruction is in its midst. Oppression and deceit do not depart from its streets." So he's describing a bad scene in their city. People weren't treating one another properly under this newly formed government. And David knew that the new leadership that was emerging among his people wasn't good for the people, wasn't good for society. And truly, leaders who are driven by selfish ambition will hurt people and will damage society. That's one of the reasons we're in such a mess. Because men are driven by selfish ambition. And so David, observing that, he's praying, and he prays, his prayer is, "Lord, divide their tongues." Why is he praying that? Well, he's referring to what the Lord did in Genesis chapter 11. When he confused their communication, when he interrupted the people's ability to communicate. And here David prayed that the Lord would do that, to intervene, to confuse their communication, to divide their tongues, to stop their plans. Why would he pray that way? Well, if you read Genesis chapter 11, the story of the Tower of Babel, the story is when people came together in rebellion against God to defy the Lord's command. Remember, the Lord said, "Spread out and fill the earth." They said, "Let's stay together, build a tower to heaven, make a name for ourselves." And the Lord responded by confusing their languages to scatter them. And so David here, seeing a situation of rebellion and defiance and the problems that it caused, prayed that way. Lord, divide their tongues, scatter their communication. It shows us that David was searching the scriptures for the way the Lord might work. And as he discovered it, he prayed accordingly. Again, that's a very good example. To not only let your trouble drive you to prayer, but let your trouble drive you to the Word. To discover how the Lord may work in the record of how he has worked historically. Because God's consistent. You can go back and you can find situations that are very similar to your own life and see ways that God has worked in the past. So David's doing that in prayer, in the Word. He continued in verse 12 to describe this situation and why it was particularly painful for him. Look at verse 12. He said, "For it is not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could bear it, nor is it one who hates me, who has exalted himself against me, then I could hide from him. But it was you, a man, my equal, my companion, and my acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together and walked to the house of God in the throng or in the crowd. 2 Samuel 15 tells us that as David was fleeing from Jerusalem, he got word that Ahithophel, one of his closest confidants, his trusted friend, his advisor, a man that he had worshiped with, someone that he thought would stand with him when everyone else left, that this trusted counselor Ahithophel had actually conspired with Absalom, supporting Absalom's rebellion, and had become an influential part of Absalom's newly formed government. And it hurt him deeply. Look, the pain of the betrayal was only intensified because of the past relationships that he enjoyed. And if you've had it happen to you, the closer the relationship is, the greater the pain when there's betrayal or disloyalty. And that's what David was going through. If it was somebody that he didn't know, that he wasn't connected with, it would be one thing. But this is somebody he thought he could trust. Look, Jesus knows the pain of betrayal. Remember that Judas walked with Jesus 3 years. He was able to see and hear and be a part of Jesus' ministry, and yet he sold Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. And although Jesus knew what he was up to, he gave Judas many opportunities to change his mind, even up to the last minute. Do you remember what happened? Matthew 26:49-50. Matthew 26:49-50 said that immediately Judas went up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and he kissed him. And Jesus' response was this. He said to him, "Friend, why have you come?" He called Judas friend, even as Judas was betraying him. But David is a good example of many things. But this is what he was thinking. Besides the pain of it all, he had a suggestion for the Lord to deal with Ahithophel and others who were along with Absalom. Look at verse 15. This is what he was thinking as he's going through this pain. He says concerning him, "Let death seize them. Let them go down alive into hell, for wickedness is in their dwellings and among them." Wow. Now, again, in looking at this, I have to tell you it's a biblical suggestion. This is one that was inspired by Numbers chapter 16. If you remember the story, a man named Korah led a rebellion against Moses and Aaron. And in Numbers 16, verse 30, this is what the Lord did. He opened up the ground, and the earth swallowed up Korah and Abiram and Dathan and everyone else that was in their tents that didn't get away. The earth swallowed them up, and they went down into the pit and closed in over them. Again, this shows that David was searching the Word. He personally is just saying, "Lord, this is a good idea. You did this before. You could do this again. It's a good idea." Now, the sad part here is that David had actually forgotten that he was guilty of betraying a close friend. He was the one who slept with his friend Uriah's wife while Uriah was out fighting for David, extremely loyal to David. And then David was the one that arranged for the murder of Uriah. And the Lord had been very patient with David, but David, in his hurt and his pain and his humanity, wasn't recalling how much mercy he received. His sin looked very bad on someone else. And that's often the way it works. Look, whenever you begin to see wrong in other people's lives, it's very important to do self-examination. Whenever you start to see things that are wrong in other people's lives, if you see sin in someone else's life, it's so important to stop and consider your own life. Jesus instructed us that way in Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verse 3. Matthew 7, 3-5, he said, "Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me remove the speck from your eye,' and look, there's a plank in your own eye?" Jesus said, "Hypocrite, first remove the plank in your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." It's so important to stop and say, "Lord, I'm seeing this, but is that in me? Am I seeing it because I'm very familiar with the material? Lord, remove it from me." And then, and only then, are you able to effectively minister to somebody that's going through that type of experience or has that kind of sin in their lives. Don't forget the mercy, the grace that you've been given, the patience, the forgiveness that's been extended towards you. In this moment, David wasn't thinking about it. He was hurt greatly. And yes, seeking the Lord, seeking his word, and doing the right thing, working through all this with the Lord as he's taking it to the Lord. And then in verse 16, he says to the Lord, "As for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me. Evening and morning and noon I will pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice." If you take notes, you might want to note this verse, mark it particularly, because this is really the turning point in this psalm. You know, up to this point, he began speaking of himself, his need, his feelings, his experience, his ideas, his desire to find relief. And then he spoke of his opponents, those that were making his life difficult. He made some biblical suggestions. But then here, he truly embraces, affirms, and declares his role, his action, his plan forward. And he says, "In all this, I am going to pray, and the Lord will save me." In other words, I'm not going to try to save myself. I'm not going to ask anybody else to save me, but the Lord will. He said, I'm going to keep praying, and he's going to hear my voice, and he will save. Look, this is the way to get through any difficult situation, is to pray and pray and pray through it. Isaiah 26:3. Isaiah 26:3 says, "You will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you, Lord, because he trusts in you." It's to get your mind focused on the Lord. And whatever the hurt, whatever the pain, whatever the struggle, whatever the opposition or betrayal, the hard to understand situations, let all that become motivation for you to keep praying. You see, praying is a position of faith. It's expressing your determination to trust in him. Jesus spoke a parable in Luke chapter 18 to illustrate this idea that men always ought to pray and not lose heart. He said it this way, Luke 18, beginning in verse 2. He said, "There was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God nor regard man. Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him saying, 'Get justice for me from my adversary.' And he would not for a while. But afterward he said within himself, 'Though I do not fear God or regard man, yet because this woman troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by continual coming she weary me.' Then the Lord said, 'Hear what the unjust judge said. And shall not God avenge his own elect who cry out to him day and night, though he bears long with them? I tell you, he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth?'" That's what Jesus said. His whole point was that if a woman can cry out to an unjust judge, trusting that he could do something about her situation, even knowing that he didn't really even care, but if he just kept coming to him, she would annoy him to the point that he would answer, then how much more should we cry out to the Lord who loves us and has called us to be his own? You see, our faith is expressed in prayer and our continuance in prayer. We're saying, Lord, you can do something about it. Lord, I trust that you can. I trust that you love me. Lord, I trust that you have my best interest at heart. And so your prayer life is an expression of your faith. How's your prayer life?
This has been part 1 of the message, Feel Like Running Away, from Psalms 55 and 56. If you have any questions about today's program, or you'd like prayer for something, don't hesitate to contact us. Just go to our website, learnthewordradio.com, and click on the Contact Us button. We'd love to hear from you and how we can pray for you. Again, to reach out, just click the Contact Us button on our website, learnthewordradio.com. That brings us to the end of today's program, but we're so glad you joined us for this edition of Learn the Word.